Okay, so what we ended with last time is we finished the throne scene where we have the picture of God, the Father, and then we had the picture of the Lamb. And what did the Lamb receive from the Father? Do y'all remember?
Oh.
Okay, the scroll. And what was on the outside of it?
7 seals.
Okay, 7 seals. Okay, so what we are having now is just the development of that going forward. These 7 seals are the breaking of those various seals, and as the Lamb breaks those, something happens. And so we'll see that going forward. And one thing I just want to highlight when you come to 6 and 7 is that what you have is, again, this contrast of what's happening in heaven versus what's happening on the earth. And you'll have these kind of going back and forth. So we'll highlight that more as we get into the specific sections. But so let's go ahead and jump into chapter 6. Who would like to read chapter 6 for us here? Go ahead.
Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then they were each given a white robe and are told to rest a little longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, and the great ones, and the generals, and the rich, and the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand?"
All right, thank you. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to mention when we talked about the scroll, remember the scroll has been sealed, and we talked about how that's a pretty strange concept, but where have we seen a book that was sealed in the past that obviously at some point needed to be opened? Y'all remember? Yeah, from Daniel, okay, from Daniel chapter 12. That was the picture there. And so we mentioned it was sealed for many days in the future. By this point, we're many days in the future. So he's taking it and he's unsealing that. Okay, so what words or phrases stand out to you here in this section? Let's go through the observation.
Come.
Okay, yeah, it's said multiple times. What else? Okay. All right, good. Not everybody at once.
Seals.
Okay, seals. All right, good.
Lamb.
Okay, lamb.
There's a lot of different weapons.
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Weapons, bows and spears, and then they're going to also use wildlife as weapons.
Okay, yeah, good. What else?
Conquering and conquer.
Okay, good.
A lot of horses.
Yeah, a lot of horses. What else?
The comment about the wheat and barley and oil and wine
Yeah, that's kind of an unusual one.
seems out of place.
Yeah, okay. What else?
White robe.
Okay, that's been seen before, and we're going to see more of that. What else?
Living creature.
Okay, yeah. So we saw those back in 4 and 5, if you remember. That's the cherubim. What else?
Souls.
Okay, good. Let's get one more. Anything else jumped out?
How long?
Okay, good, good. All right, so remember, as we look at this particular section, John is looking at some things, and so he looks at who in verse 1, and what does he do?
He watches when the Lamb is opening that first seal.
Yeah, exactly. And so as a result of that, you have 4 different horses that come out, and what are their colors?
Bright red, black,
Okay, white.
Pale.
And the other one's pale. Actually, on the pale, it's kind of unusual, but if you look at, like commentaries mention this, it's actually the word that meant like a pale green. So it might not be what you had in your mind. I didn't have that in my mind until I went back and looked at it. But that's actually in the word itself. Now, the great thing about apocalyptic literature is because we might think, what do these horses mean? And people have speculated everywhere about what they mean. But yet, does John tell us what these specific people mean? We kind of yes and no. I got one going yes, I got one going no. And they're both right there together. So what do you mean by yes, he does say what they mean?
Well, with regard to the black horse, he talks about the price of merchandise, which may suggest a famine.
Yeah. So it's economic, just to a certain extent. Then he specifically says there in verse 4 what he does. It is to take peace from the earth. So it's like we don't have to kind of just theorize, like, what is this about? He tells us exactly. Now, Byron was the one that was going through and shaking his head no. So why is it not?
You asked, does he tell us what the horse is?
Oh, okay.
Okay, so, no, he doesn't tell us the horse. However, the horses are similar to those that were mentioned in Zechariah. Bringing judgment, right? So,
Yeah,
it
exactly.
may not, the colors may not mean much at all, other than there's the horse. The result of what the judgment that comes is pretty significant.
Right.
That's what's happening.
Yeah, so and it is true. He doesn't give specifics of what, it's not like in some of the other places where it says, here's what this means. But it does tell us, like, here's what they're going to be doing. Here's what they're going to be involved in. So we have the white one, and what is he allowed to go and do?
Conquer.
Yeah, to conquer, okay? We have the red one. What is he permitted to do?
Take peace.
Okay, take peace from the earth. Then we have the third one, which is the black horse. What is his particular job? Yeah, famine, or at least it would be related to famine. Its economic turmoil would be connected with that as well. And then what's the fourth one, and what is he allowed to do?
He's death, and he's allowed to kill with the sword and famine. pestilence and wild beasts.
Okay, good. All right, so we'll come back and talk about those some more here in the interpretation here in just a second. But remember, we're just trying to observe what the text is saying, okay? So then we have the fifth seal, and what does he see with the fifth seal whenever it's opened?
Soul under the altar?
Okay, all right, so the souls on the altar, and what had happened to them? What were they slain for?
Witnessing the word of God.
Yeah, for the word of God and for their testimony, right? For the witness that they had borne. And what are they crying?
How long before you avenge?
Yeah, how long? And I mentioned this last Sunday when we kind of unpacked, or I guess how we went through a lot really, really quickly. But we talked about Psalm 90, remember? About the saints there asking how long, and about the connection there with Revelation chapter 20. And so this is the question that Revelation is primarily answering, is about the response to these particular individuals. And what was the response given to them in this particular section?
Rest a little while longer.
Okay, yeah, rest a little while longer, and there's a reason for that, is that it's until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be completed who are to be killed. Okay, then what happens when the sixth seal is opened?
Earthquake.
Okay, yeah, there's an earthquake. What else?
Celestial.
Bloody moon.
Yeah, well, and it's on the moon. Remember, if I remember right, it was like blood. It wasn't one of the words that was mentioned, but there's a lot of likes in this particular as well. But it's the same concept. You have the moon like blood. What else do you have that happens?
Stars falling to the earth.
Okay. Yeah, the sun's black.
And the kings of the earth recognize that this is the judgment of the Lamb.
Yeah.
God, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you already talked about who was affected. It's the kings of the earth, and then he goes across the board. The great ones, the generals, the rich, the powerful, and everyone, slave and free. Okay? And what do they try to do?
And hide.
Yeah, and they're hiding, as Byron pointed out, from the wrath of the Lamb. And what do they say then? I think it's the last line here.
Fallen us, for who can stand?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so that's kind of just the survey of everything that we read, kind of working that in a little bit. So this is part of what I love to do. What Old Testament text, and this is an interpretation now, what Old Testament text formed the foundation of this chapter? Again, we mentioned there's all kinds of references to the Old Testament, and really, if you don't know the prophets, you can't understand what Revelation's talking about. Yeah, Zechariah chapter 1, and it's also in chapter 6. Now, for me, Zechariah is burned in my mind because that was the first Bible class that I taught when I came here. It was the first time I'd ever taught Zechariah. But in that case, you have two different points where he mentions these horses are chariots, is the way they're described there. Now, it's possible that he is seeing chariots here. It would just kind of depend on the same kind of arrangement. But regardless, these are connected. They're the same kind of images that are back there from the Old Testament. Also, another important text on this that you might not be aware of, that you can go back and read on your own time, is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14, has almost like step by step by step the same type of judgments that are laid out here. So if you want to mark that, it's Ezekiel 14, 12 to 23, and we're not going to read that for sake of time. Now, what do the writers represent, though? I guess that's probably the more important question.
The riders, you said?
Mm-hmm. Well, riders, horses, you can kind of mesh all that together, but
If I wanted to put it in one group, it would be like there's some kind of turmoil.
yeah,
for the judgment.
Yeah, it's judgment. And obviously, one thing that we've been talking about throughout this, we asked the last couple of weeks, why is 4 and 5 at this particular point in the book? And part of the reason for that is to show the sovereignty of God. Well, when you look now at chapter 6 about all these things that are happening, these are not things that are happening just on their own. These are things that are caused and brought about by the actions of the Lamb. And if you combine that with what Zechariah is saying, these are concepts that are within the control and the power of the Lamb as he goes through and brings turmoil and that kind of concept. One man said that these are the natural and political disasters throughout the world that are caused by Christ in order to judge unbelievers who persecute Christians and to vindicate his people. So those are kind of the dual image that's brought here. And it's just showing, again, this sovereignty of God controlling the events that are happening in the world. Okay, now let's kind of walk through some of these. We already know what the peace from the earth concept was in the sense of they're described. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail here in a second. But let's talk about verse 6 real quick. What did this statement from among the living creatures mean? That's the one that you had mentioned, Jeremy, that was a bit unusual.
I had always taken it to be famine,
Mm-hmm.
because famine shortages bring economic turmoil, but this is very similar to, was it Elijah that was in the city trapped, and they talked about the price of the food, and that tomorrow this stuff will sell pretty cheap,
Mm-hmm.
right? That who's in control of that situation? It's God.
Right. Yeah,
And
and
we probably think economists or, shortages, but who's really driving this as a judgment?
yeah, and so they're obviously related, right? And I guess I don't want to diminish the famine concept, but one of the things that I think is important to understand about this is who's in control not only of the food supply, but also the economic system. God is. And obviously we have interactions and roles in that, but the way that he's describing this is he's the one that's determining the price. His particular person is coming and saying that. And so let's look at a little bit of this to understand this, because he's not weighing this out in dollars and or anything like that. So we're kind of, when's the last time you went and bought barley at the market? You don't do these kind of things, but these would have been very normal for them. So let's get the measurements here. What is a denarius? Okay, it's a day's wage here. And now for us, when he says that a quart of wheat for a denarius, we might think, well, I don't, it sounds good to me, right? We wouldn't know anything about it. But if you go back and look at the pricing, that would have been 8 to 16 times the normal price. So we're talking already, have you ever gone and looked at the price of cars lately? All the way, there's many things that the cost is way, way up right now. We're already kind of, imagine if it was 8 to 16 on things that you eat on a normal basis. That's the description here. Further, the quart of wheat was enough usually to sustain one person for a day. Now imagine working all day in the fields and all you get for all that work is just enough for you to eat for that day. That's not very much. And that's the picture here. Now barley is a lesser used grain, and so 3 quarts of that would usually be enough to provide for a family. So in that case, it's still a lot more expensive, is the same concept, but it's just showing, again, economic conditions that have changed. Now, there's some that are not affected here. What is not affected with the price of this? Yeah, the wine and the oil, okay? So these are some things that usually are not connected to a one-time or they're not connected to a kind of a residual harvest or something that you continue to plant. For example, where do you get your oil and your wine usually from? Are they an annual or a perennial? Well, you're talking agriculture. Okay, likely you got your oil from olives, and an olive is coming from a tree, right? You harvest that one time a year. You get your grapes from a grapevine, and you harvest that one time a year. It's a perennial. So it's just kind of a different kind of concept. But apparently that's not affected as the prices. Okay, now when we look at these kind of spectrum of the horsemen here, what are some other texts that are helpful to understand this text? Do you have any that may come to mind? Does any of this sound familiar to other places? We already mentioned Daniel 12, which I think is really important for all of this, but I'm not going to go back and just rehash everything. But that was a judgment on the people of God, as well as just a time of turmoil. But are there other texts that come to your mind? Mention Zechariah, but
Well, I can't cite specific texts, but Amos, Jeremiah, almost Joel, all of them talk about when God has a judgment, that there's going to be famine, there's going to be disease, there's going to be wild beasts that come back into the land. And I think it's an idea that from the Old Testament, that what keeps us at peace, what keeps all these things at bay is God. And when we're not faithful, He removes that protection.
right. And if you take what the prophets do and you actually go back even farther, these are the same kind of things that Moses predicted. If you go back and look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, or you look at Leviticus chapter 18, you know, where Moses goes through and says, hey, if you're faithful, you're going to have all of these great things happen to you. But if you're unfaithful, you're going to have all of these awful things happen to you. If you compare those lists, they're almost exactly the same walking down it. Go ahead.
With regard to the sixth one, a passage that's very similar to that is in Hebrews 1, when is emphasizing the superiority of Jesus over the angels and his eternal nature. He says, you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hand. They will perish, but you will remain. And to the point at hand, verse 12, like a cloak you will fold them up, and they will be changed. And that's the kind of language we read here.
Yeah, that's a good reference. Now, probably one thing that I should go ahead and do here is when you look at these descriptions here, generally people put them in two specific categories that go back to how you understand the book and the dates that are being brought up. So, for example, I was borrowing one of Byron's commentaries by Arthur Ogden, right? And so he believes that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he goes through step by step here and compares it to Matthew 24. And if you look at Matthew 24, verses 6 through 11, you have almost line by line. It's almost exactly the same description that Jesus predicted. Now, I also went through and looked over at Harkrider and Haley, I think, and I was looking at some others. Now, they don't make the other references there, but they do go through and say that these are just kind of general judgments there. Now, I'll give you my own kind of personal judgment on it. I think that he's talking about the same things as Matthew 24 in this particular section. And you may not agree with that, but there's a lot of parallels between the descriptions. But regardless, these are the kind of things that God does when he brings down a nation, is he brings these kind of enemies and destruction upon it. Okay, so let's talk about the souls here for just a minute. When you look, we've got to walk through these first four. There's peace that's removed from the earth, so there's war in the world. There's economic turmoil that likely would have been in place of an army coming through. There's death. There's even all kinds of pestilence and those kind of things. And now we have a vision of the altar here. And so where are these souls and how did they get there?
Described as being under the altar, and they were the faithful that witnessed for Christ.
Right.
They wouldn't deny.
Yeah, exactly. And apparently they had some connection with the tribulation. It's not mentioned here, but you'll have some discussion about the tribulation here in chapter 7. And so what are they wanting done for them?
Vengeance.
Yeah, vengeance. And it's not revenge, right? That's not the idea. What are they wanting here?
Justice.
Yeah, justice. There's an evil, a wrong that has been done, and they're wanting God to step in. And so they're asking how long. And so the response is interesting because in a sense it shows this now but not yet concept of the kingdom, okay? Because what is the present response that God gives?
Wait a little longer.
Well, that is true. There's more that he gives though. He gives them something.
A white robe.
A white robe. They're sanctified. They're given a celebratory. That's part of the concept. But remember, a white robe was given to who?
Those who overcame.
Those who overcame, to victors. Okay, so you have an acknowledgement of that. But then, what are they told to do? Rest and wait. Okay, so it's present. They're victors, but yet the ultimate victory has not completely come to pass. Okay. And so these concepts of the white robes are a conquering general for the Romans. They would wear a white robe. There's a lot of other references to that as we go through the book. Okay.
That parallels Lazarus and the rich man, where Lazarus was in comfort while the rich man was in torment. So they're in a place of comfort. A couple chapters later, with the parable of the unjust judge, it's mentioned that, and shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him?
Mm-hmm.
And so we see parallels to the Gospels as well.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a couple of things that I think are important. Just these are sort of application, but they're for us to remember. There are some religious groups that teach basically you go to sleep. You have a soul sleep when you die. What does this say about that? Yeah, you're awake. Further, a lot of people ask what happens to you after you die. Pretty good example of the same kind of things. Okay? So you are who you are. Go ahead.
But they're aware of things that are going on because they're told to go ahead and just rest, but they want that judgment and they want God to avenge, so they know bad stuff is still happening.
Yeah, and part of it, I think here is, this may be in context of what they've already experienced, right? And then they're being told more about what is presently going on. So anyway, I'm not going to get into all of the speculations, but there are some things we can nail down regarding that. Okay, now, who are the people that persecuted these Christians? Because he mentions that that's who they want the vengeance on.
Everyone listed in 12 through 16.
Okay. Now, what I kind of have more in mind on this is generally when we think about who is persecuting Christians, almost always we think Rome. And that was definitely true. Like, we don't deny that. But was it just Rome?
Just as those who dwell on the earth.
Yeah. So a lot of times it was the Jews. For example, who was the first one to be martyred and who killed him?
Stephen.
And who was he killed by?
Jews.
The Jews, right? And if you remember, Paul was actually the tool to go about that process. And he was a Jew that was going through and eventually, going through and killing some of them. And then if you remember the enemies that are mentioned here at the beginning, you have a synagogue of Satan that is pictured as ones that have been fighting against the Christians there. And that's ones that apparently are Jews that had rejected the Messiah. So there's at least some understanding why people kind of take this both ways here. Now let's talk about this next section here. What is the meaning of the description of the world there in verses 12 through 14? Because I guess there's kind of two possible ways we could take this. When you read that, what does it sound like?
What happened after the crucifixion, you know, where there was an earthquake and the sun was turned to.
Sure. Okay, yeah, so what happened after the crucifixion? Or, I mean, just a judgment on a nation, right? Byron's already pointed out that a lot of the cities here in this area have been destroyed by an earthquake already. So you have those kind of things that happen to a city. But generally, this also sounds like the end of time, doesn't it? So what you're basically in the camp of how the commentators split it. Some will go through and say this is a judgment on a city, the city that's being described throughout the book, or multiple cities, or it's talking about the end of time. So what I want us to do here is I want us to talk about how the prophets use prophetic language for a second, because it's really easy to get kind of mixed up on this. So when the prophets use prophetic language like this, they can be talking about a local event and use cosmic language to talk about it, okay? And the reason they do that is because the local event is an example of what's going to happen at the end. Okay, so he can be describing either Jerusalem or Rome in cosmic terms because eventually all kingdoms are going to experience the same kind of concept. It's just one example of what's going to happen in the end. So people make a lot of mistakes about this, and so we just have to be careful about that, because it's easy to go through and read the prophets and think they're always talking about the end of the world. They're not. Even though they can be talking about a specific situation, it is in context for something greater. For example, if you looked at Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 through 13, we won't look at that for sake of time, but it's almost the same type of description. I mean, it is cosmic destruction. Stars falling, if I remember right, all of these same kind of ideas. And yet, in 13 and verse 1, he doesn't say it's the end of the world. He says it was the end of Babylon. Okay? You have the same thing whenever he describes Edom. Ezekiel describes Egypt. Joel 2, you just did Joel, right? Same kind of concept, and he's talking about Jerusalem there. So again, these are just one example of this ultimate day of the Lord when all authorities and rulers are going to be judged. So at this moment, though, it's unclear exactly who is being judged, so we just gotta keep reading, right? That's not the end of the story. There's more to be talked about. Okay, now let's ask this last interpretive question and then we'll make a couple of applications. Why are the people asking for the mountains and rocks to fall on them? And why is that going to help them?
Seems like they're wanting to hide.
Yeah.
And it won't come.
Yeah, it's what always happens. When we sin, what do we want to try to do? Hide. Okay? And when judgment comes, the same concept. We want to run from it. And both of these are saying that's not going to happen. Now, this is also imagery from the Old Testament, often used to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. And one reason that some people think that this is the destruction of Jerusalem is because if you read Luke 23, 26 through 31, what Jesus says to I think it's the women that were weeping at that point, I mean, it's almost like cut and paste. It's very, very similar there. Okay, so questions, comments, anything on that section? Did a lot of talking there, but you can breathe for a second. There's a lot of information. All right, let's talk about how we live this text. And then we'll try to get a little bit. I may not get all the 7. But we can get some of it. How do we live this text? And I got 2 questions that I think help this. What can we learn about the purpose of God's judgments from this text?
Well, God's judgments are meant to bring repentance, even though it doesn't say so yet. It will. There will be an expression, and they did not repent.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so I think there is the idea of repentance. I also think there is the idea of vengeance on those who have mistreated his people.
I mean, this is the no-no word out in the world. When you talk about God's judgment, I mean, that's whoa, we don't want to talk about that. I mean, first off, we can't even judge each other. But further, the idea that God would bring a cosmic judgment is almost like that's the thing that trips up a lot of people. But in this context, there's a lot of things that show, no, this is necessary. It has to be done. And there's something that is done through it. Go ahead, Ed.
I would key on your phrase, it has to be done, and it has to be done because our God is perfectly just. And there is no way that he can live with unrepentant sin that's not dealt with by his judgment.
Right.
And be true to himself.
Yeah, so what you have, remember, in the judgment of God, two things always happen. The first is the righteous are delivered. And that we don't always think about that, but judgment is necessary to deliver the righteous. It's always all the way through. Why was Noah's world destroyed? To deliver Noah out of that. Why was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? To deliver Lot out of that. It's the same kind of concepts. But it's also done to judge the wicked. Now, what's interesting about this is almost like the thing, again, that people will have problems with. And they'll say, I just can't believe in a God that would bring ultimate judgment. And yet, in this text, what would you say to these people that had been killed under the altar for just telling the truth and living a life of love? What has to be done?
I'd say they don't see it in broader context, but if one of their loved ones who was innocent was killed, what did they want?
Immediately.
Yeah. Right? That's we all believe in justice. We all believe in vengeance to right or wrong. I think the problem is that the world isn't convinced that there's a wrong to be righted.
Well, and you see what's interesting about this. So when someone comes through and says, God's wrong for bringing X judgment, okay? And generally people say that there's suffering in the world. How could God allow this kind of thing? Two things happen that are really, really interesting to me. The first thing is they go through and they immediately criticize God on whatever particular judgment. And in the critique, they're saying they know better than God. Okay? They know better than God. They have to. And the whole point is, the way the scripture is laid out, is he knows everybody. He's created everybody. He's outside of time. He knows the thoughts and intents of the heart, guys. If anybody should be in the position of making a judgment, it should be him. And then the irony is that then they have a problem with God making the judgment. Okay? That means that they're holding God to a standard. Do you see that? How could you say that the judgment is wrong if there's not some standard that is there? But think about those people that reject God. Is there a standard outside of him? There's nowhere to go, guys. If there is no God, there is no justice. And inevitably, what happens is when people deny God, something happens, first thing they want to do is they want to cry foul. There has to be justice. And the thing is, if you take God out of that, there is no justice. It's not there. And so we have to be very, very careful with this concept. And that's why when you have Christians in the first century, they're talking about justice and they say, Lord, come. Please come. Bring it. It's because of these kinds of concepts. They know he will do right. They know that they'll be delivered and that all evil will be held responsible. Okay, so the concepts about justice and judgment are really important here. But then think about, how does this text show who we should respect, fear, and obey? Because that's what's happening in this text. There's a discussion about two different parties and how they responded to the person that is going to bring justice. So how does this text show who we should respect, fear, and obey? Yeah, yeah. That's inevitably that's going to be there, right? Any other thoughts? What are these events being used for? You talked a little bit about it, Byron, but remember, Jesus is controlling some things. So what is he trying to do?
In some ways, yeah, it naturally leads into chapter 7, because there's a pause before the seventh seal. And he says, don't harm the earth, sea, or trees until we have sealed the servants of God on their foreheads. This gets back to the letting the tares and the wheat grow together. And God says, don't pull out the tares, because you're going to pull out some of the wheat. We'll harvest them all together, and then we'll separate them. Mm-hmm. So there's still a period of time at which God hasn't finalized who is owning them. So
right.
There is a chance for repentance to come.
Yeah. Yeah. So he is humbling a nation that has elevated themselves against him and against his people. And so he's bringing judgment, but it's also repentance and deliverance here. And so when you look at the way that this text frames it, the first thing is those who have been martyred innocently, do they have the power to bring about justice for their cause?
Not on their own.
Not on their own. They are powerless. Okay? And so that's you and me. We're powerless. Okay? But then think about the question that is offered by the highest and mightiest, the wealthy, the great, and the powerful. What is their question? One said, how long? The other one says, that's more of a request.
Yeah.
But they ask, who can stand? What's the answer to that? Nobody can. Okay? No one can stand. And so that's the question that all of us have to answer. There are some people, like he lays out, that are able to stand in his presence with no problem. And there are other people that cannot stand in his presence. So when you look at these concepts, again, they really drive at who do we respect, truly respect, who do we fear, and who are we going to obey? And see, what's interesting is, again, when we look at these concepts of judgment, oftentimes we think of this as God being angry and bringing wrath. And all of those things are true. But it is a response of love. In our society, what we want to do is we want to put love on one side and wrath on the other side, don't we? And yet, the response here of wrath is a response of love. It is a love of the people that are listening to him. And he's bringing that wrath against human evil, and then as a means to deliver the righteous. Okay? So it's just, I think we get mixed up on judgment. We get really scared of it. I still, even to this day, the concept of having, people for eternity going to hell, that's a really, really disturbing concept. And there are many times where God is going through and he's rendering justice. That seems really strange. I don't like that. But I wouldn't have it any other way. It has to be done. Okay? All right, so we'll stop right there. I did not make as much progress as I wanted, but I'm at least getting a chapter at a time. That's not too bad.